Okay, so one of the first things we're going to do in creating our trees is we are going to create this sort of base modular shape. What this is one sort of branching shape that we can use for both the trunk of the tree as well as individual branches on that tree. And you can see that this branch is actually a duplicate of that main shape. So first that base branch is a duplicate, and then each sort of branch branching off of those are again duplicates of the space shape. This workflow basically allows you to create that one piece, UV map and texture it, and duplicate it around, so it saves on time and effort. And obviously, when you have hundreds of assets to produce for a game or a film, anything you can do to save on time and effort just makes it easier to finish that game or film. And the other thing that works well for using a modular workflow like this, where you're duplicating things or instancing things around, is it allows you to use the same material and the same texture for multiple assets, and that makes a huge difference in a game engine where every material and texture that needs to be loaded up can affect game performance. So let's go to a new scene and let's begin that branching piece. Now, as always, with general best practices for modeling, is you always start with reference. So let's say I'm making a maple tree, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look up pictures of maple trees. Now, what is not good reference is a sketch of a maple tree. So this is not useful to us because this is someone else's interpretation of how a maple tree works. However, something like this, a photograph of an actual maple tree, tells us how it really grew. What's more, a bunch of different photographs of a bunch of different maple trees help us start to gain an understanding of the logic behind how these trees grow. So in each of these photos, we're seeing, so a basic commonality is you've got sort of the one thin trunk. That's not real. So you've got the one base trunk, and then it networks out, so it sort of branches out like veins into slightly smaller, large branches, and then those branches in turn, um, again, end up uh, branching off into smaller branches still. So this is what I mean. So you get that big trunk, slightly smaller piece for that main branch, and then they just every time they branch off, they get a little bit smaller, but they're always that really beautiful sort of long, snaking, vein-like shape. And then the for the leaves themselves, you've got this. Once it looks like once the branch gets thin enough to a certain point and high enough, you start getting these leaves growing off, and each sort of large leaf is at the end of its own tiny little stem, well, tiny branch stem slash thing. Okay, so let's build up this snaking piece that we're going to use to duplicate around. Now, if you are new to Maya, or you haven't been modeling in a while, or you're using Maya default settings, and you go to begin with something like a cylinder, there's a problem you have to address right away. So this is base settings, I've just created a cylinder. And notice how many sides we've got around this. So we have so many polygons around the outside of the cylinder. And if we say start to duplicate this around, or I should say if we start merging extruding this around, I'm just going to go create a face for myself to easily extrude from. So I'm going to select that cylinder and go to inputs here on the channel box. So you can get to the channel box by flicking through these tabs on the right hand side of your screen, or by going Control A, and that will flick between channel box and attribute editor. So in the channel box, under inputs, you see polycylinder 1. That's the creation history that said, hey, I created this thing, it's a polycylinder. If I click on that, I have those same settings that you can find under create polygon primitives, cylinder, and options, which is this little box next to cylinder. So those are your creation settings. You still have them after you create a cylinder for the first time. And you can actually adjust them. So if I come in here under polycylinder and it says, where it says subdivision cap, which is this starburst of triangles on the top of the cylinder, it's at 1, which means it's on. If I set it to 0, it turns off, and I now have just a flat face, which is easy to grab and extrude around. Okay, so let's say I start extruding this. Control E is the hotkey for extrude, so it just makes your life a little bit easier. So let's say I'll extrude that up, and I'll scale that in, and I'll drop a little bit of a rotation on that. And let's come in and grab these vertices from earlier as well. Let's scale them in a little bit. And I think we can probably rotate them also. Well, we're just basically trying to build in a little bit of organic variability here. When things grow, they don't grow in an even straight line or an even way. They tend to twist and change a little bit. And we'll do another extrusion, and I just want to remind you guys this is an example of what not to do. So we've just done a couple extrusions, and we're not even finished with our branch yet, even if I scaled it up or whatever. Let me show you the problem with this. Okay, so I'm going to go up to display, heads up display, and what we want is poly count. Poly count lets us see how many triangles are in our scene, but specifically how many triangles are associated with one object. Now, currently that's 156, if my eyes are not deceiving me, and that's of an unfinished branch. So imagine we had 3 more extrusions, and then we duplicate this around 10 times. We're starting to get into the territory of quite a large poly count for a tree, and if you're going to have hundreds of these in the scene, you can imagine that's going to reduce your frames per second, or reduce your render time dramatically, or increase your render time, reduce your frames per second. Either way, it's going to make your work lag. It's going to be really unattractive. It's terrible for performance, and it just doesn't look very good. So you're just like, this is such a smooth shape. It just does not look good at all. So let me show you a better way of doing this. What I like to do when modeling to protect myself from having too many polygons at the outset is I like to change these creation options here. So under create polygon primitives cylinder options, so if I click on that, rather than coming in with 20 subdivisions, why don't we come in with, say, let's just come in with 8. There's one more thing I want to change as well. Let's make sure we come in with the subdivision cap turned off. There we go. So changing the subdivisions it starts with means I get a much more low poly cylinder at the very beginning. And I'll just extrude this same number of times I extruded the last one, just to show you how many polygons we've got now. Where the previous one, after 3 extrusions, had 156, this one only has 60. And I reckon we could probably even reduce that a little bit more. Let's just see what it looks like with 6 subdivisions. So I just want to go back in time so that there's no longer any extrude face data on this. Okay, let's just reduce that to 7 looks kind of cool. And 6, yeah, I reckon we could get away with 6. I think we could totally get away with 6. Okay. So, before I start growing this, let's actually adjust it just a little bit, because nowhere in life is a growing thing ever going to be perfectly round. So I'm just going to grab some of these vertices and just shuffle them about. I just want to break the perfection of that shape a little bit. Not too far. I mean, we're going for subtlety here more than anything. Um, and so we're going for subtlety. We just want it to be less imperfect. We want to take the mathematical um, perfection out of this. So I'm just breaking that shape a bit, and I'll come in and I'll make sure that the bottom doesn't quite match the top either. And you'll notice I've already sort of altered the shape of this tree at the base before I've done any extrusions. I wanna make sure it's already looking like it's growing up from the ground. Okay, so now I've altered this and made it a little bit less perfect. Let's go Control E again to extrude. One of the things that I like to do when I'm extruding with organic shapes is with each extrusion, I'll scale it in, but I'll also come in and I'll start rotating it. And I like to create this sort of like twisting effect. You can imagine it's just slightly twisting with each extrusion. And I'll come in and I'll move the vertices around slightly. All of it's about breaking up those clean mathematical lines. Trying to avoid any really sharp changes in direction like that. I can play with that huge sharp change in direction's probably better off with having another branch coming out of it. So when you're building your main branches, just stick with the idea that you're going for subtlety here. Once again, I'm gonna just sort of break the clean lines of these vertices a little bit. Don't go too far. Just a subtle effect. Okay. And let's do a couple more extrusions. Scaling down and rotating with each one. The great thing is that this doubles as your Harry Potter wand. So, if you can make a tree, you can make a Harry Potter wand. Next step, you create a Balrog and a sorcerer. And, I'm just mixing my movies up now. Okay. Let's save save those guys for future tutorials, huh? Okay, this is, I'm pretty happy with this. We've got our base shape, and I can even make it a little bit more snaking and interesting by scaling it up. The last thing I want to do is I want to break up this engon at the top before I duplicate this around, because, if I wanted to take this into, say, Mudbox or something to paint textures onto it, that engon's going to cause a serious problem, and it's just good practice. An engon is anything with more than 4 edges. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's just going to make our lives more difficult than it needs to be. So I'm using the multi-cut tool, and you can find that it looks like a scalpel on your polygons tab here, or it's under mesh tools, multi-cut. If I just click on one vertice, so you'll see that as I hover over it, vertices highlight. If I click on one vertice, and that's left click, and I left click on another vertice, you'll see it's created a highlight. Ooh, it's also just wrapped around the object. Move your camera frequently to make sure crazy shit won't happen. So just go back a step there. So if I left click on one vertice and I left click on another vertice, it shows me a highlight as to where it's going to cut. And if I hit enter, that will actually cut across the object, creating new geometry. I'll do one more across the top here because I want to be able to grab this edge and just poke that up and create the end of my sort of branch here. Cool. Alright, so before we duplicate this around, we now have if we look at your inputs again, there's quite a bit of history there, and before you duplicate things around, it's always a good practice to delete history so that you're not, inheriting anything that might mess with your objects later. So I'm just going to select that object and go to Edit and delete by type history. So now that's quite clean. And the last thing we want to do before we duplicate this around is actually UV map this object. So we want to make sure that we can apply textures to it. And let's break up the underside of this object as well. I'm just going to do one straight across and turn it into 2 quads. Cool. And we'll have to delete history again because we have just added a poly split. And then I will stop this video and we will do a quick UV map on this and then duplicate it around.